Hello, everybody. How are you doing? Thanks for coming to the second cognitive science talk for this fall term. Welcome, everybody. I am very excited to be introducing Adam Cohen, who will be talking to us today about theory of mind as a cognitive reflex. I very selfishly invited Adam because I first met him when he emailed me about some of his research he was doing while I was writing a book. And his work was so interesting that it influenced the way the book came out. So as soon as I found out he was moving to Ontario, I invited him to come here. So thank you very much. I'm very excited. Adam is a fabulous person to speak at the Cognitive Science Speaker Series because he did his undergraduate work at Rutgers University in the cognitive science program. So he knows how cognitive science works. He knows how a cognitive science program is supposed to look like. And I think he'll probably be happy to talk to any of the undergraduates here who are in the cognitive science program. Adam just got his PhD at UC Santa Barbara in the psychology department. His dissertation work was on domain specificity and theory of mind. And he's currently an assistant professor at the University of Western Ontario in the psychology department. He is going to be taking excellent undergraduate students looking to go to grad school to work in his lab in the coming years. So if there are any cognitive science students here who are thinking about theory of mind, and I know some of you are, you might want to consider that as an option. All right, so without any further ado, I'm just going to say, please join me in welcoming Adam. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Kristen. I've got to say it's really nice to be visiting from just down the road there at Western. And I'm really excited that you guys have this great cognitive science program here. And I'm really looking forward to your thoughts and comments on the work that I'm going to present today. So over the past couple of years, there's been a lot of interest in an ongoing debate about whether theory of mind is automatic, presumably because researchers think that automaticity has implications for the various theories of theory of mind, but also because there's still a lot that's not really known about how theory of mind works, especially automaticity. So I think that's two of the main reasons why people have been really focusing in on this issue. Now, although I think automaticity is interesting in its own right, I think there are principled reasons for considering it in conjunction with another basic characteristic of a computational system called cognitive impenetrability or penetrability. But to convince you of that, I'm going to have to tell you about a few other things first. So I'm going to proceed in two steps. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about automaticity, and I'm going to try to unpack and formalize what it means for a system to be automatic, and then I'll present some data that speaks to that issue for theory of mind. And then secondly, I'll talk about cognitive impenetrability, and I'll unpack that a little bit, and I'll present some data that speaks to what extent theory of mind may be cognitively impenetrable. And then finally, I'll consider some implications of all of this for cognitive architecture and cognitive development. I should say, by the way, if you have any questions, clarification questions, please feel free to ask. If you have more substantive discussion questions, just save those for the end. But I want everyone to be on the same page as me, so please ask any clarification questions if you have them. All right. So a central question for studying any computational system is, what are the minimum conditions for activating it? Now, I think this is actually a really good place to start to unpack the idea of automaticity, because the question's fundamentally about the front end of a computational system and the kinds of information that interacts with it and causes it to operate. And what I want to show you is that even for a system that's generally considered to be automatic and is fairly well understood, answering this question is actually going to be quite challenging. So take, for example, scotopic vision, which is just the system of rods that operate under low light conditions, like at nighttime. OK, so imagine that we put you in a dark room for, say, 30 minutes so that you're dark adapted. OK, only the rods are active. And you're given a task to just simply detect a flash of light off in the distance. Okay. Now, if we consider just two factors, the intensity of that light and the wavelength of the light, what you'll see is that detection varies as a function of these two properties. So this is called a sensitivity curve, and wavelength is plotted along the x-axis. And what you can see is that at around 560 nanometers or so, if you trace this over to the y-axis, what you can see is that the threshold is relatively low. So relatively low intensity light is enough to elicit detection. And as you move away from this point in either direction, the threshold goes up. You need higher intensity light in order to detect that flash of light. Okay, so there's two things to note. There's sort of two morals here. The first is that if you were interested in addressing whether or not scotopic vision was or was not automatic, and you tested at a light intensity, say over here, that was subthreshold, you would be misled into thinking that this system wasn't automatic when you had simply failed to meet the minimum conditions for activating the system. So instead of just asking whether a system is or is not automatic, a better way to understand the system and a way to understand it at a deeper level is to ask, well, what are the cues and what are the cue conditions for activating the system? I think what becomes obvious is when you think about it this way is that it becomes clear that automaticity is always conditional, right? It always depends on certain minimum conditions being met and exceeded by the cues. So that's sort of the first moral, right? So if it's subthreshold, you're going to miss automaticity. So we'll call this conditional automaticity. The second thing to notice is that even for a system like scotopic vision, which is as automatic as anything, there's going to be a pretty complicated set of cues and cue conditions for activating the system. Right, so essentially engaging the system is going to depend on an interacting levels of lots of factors. So for scotopic vision, some of the other factors that are relevant for detection include contrast, area, spatial frequency, duration, among others. And so the way I kind of picture things is that, for every system, you can imagine this kind of cue matrix that reveals the cues that interact with the system. And the point is that cues are not going to have a simple direct relationship with the mechanisms that they act on. Often there are going to be various dependencies. So for example, we just saw in this example with scotopic vision, right? Threshold depends on wavelength. There are going to be various necessary and sufficient conditions for activating the system. Okay, so early vision seems to me to be a paradigm case of what I'm going to call cue-driven processing. So that is when a system is confronted with only the cues, it's obligated to operate. Processing is mandatory. And of course, this is conditional on those cues meeting the minimum input conditions. I think this is, besides vision, this is probably also true for other perceptual systems. It's probably true for most neurophysiological reflexes. Okay, so that's cue-driven, or what's sometimes often called automatic processing. So what are some alternatives to cue-driven processing? Well, maybe sometimes the presence or the availability of cues isn't enough. Sometimes you need more than that. The cues alone aren't sufficient for activating the system. So one possibility is that in addition to the cues, there also have to be some what I'm going to call task features. So to give you an example, we'll call this task-driven processing. So to give you an example, imagine that I gave you sets of numbers one set at a time. So 415, 527, 13. And then on the very last set, you have to tell me what the missing number is. Now, it may not be obvious after only, does anyone know what the missing number is?
9.
Not 9. So it's probably not obvious only after 3 iterations. But if we went through this enough times, what you would eventually catch on to see is that the first 2 elements in the triplet sum to give you the third. Okay, and so in this case, it's the cues alone aren't sufficient to elicit that operation, but there's something about the task itself, something about the trial frequency that seems to be necessary along with the cues for triggering processing. Okay, but maybe you need more than that. Maybe the cues and the task features aren't sufficient for activating the system. Maybe what you need are instructions on top of the cues. Okay, so you can imagine that I give you a pair of numbers, 1 and 3, and I ask you to give me the third number by adding the first two, and you just tell me 4. Right? That's another way we could elicit processing. Okay, so in sum, we see that the minimum conditions can fall into one of these 3 categories. Maybe the cues alone Okay, so maybe the cues alone are sufficient for processing, but potentially maybe you need more than that, right? Maybe you need the cues plus some task features, but maybe that also isn't enough. Maybe you need the cues and some kind of explicit instruction to trigger processing. And just a note about terminology. So from now on, if I use the word automatic or spontaneous or controlled, these sort of commonplace terms, I'm now using them within this more formalized framework. Okay, so just so we're kind of clear on how the language is being used. Just one cautionary note, these aren't mutually exclusive, okay? So they're going to be bi-categorical, maybe even tri-categorical cases where they fall into more than one of these options. So I just gave you one where essentially this kind of addition over pairs can happen in a task-driven way or in an instruction-driven way. Okay, and so the critical question now for us is, under what conditions is the theory of mind system activated? Okay, so to give you a sense of what I mean by theory of mind, I thought I would give you an example from bowling that I really get a kick out of. So if you imagine that you're at the bowling alley with your friends, and one of your friends is up to bowl, and he throws a great shot, the pins go nuts, except for one pin that stays standing, and it's just up there kind of wobbling back and forth. Okay, so your friend turns around and he's kind of disappointed, but unbeknownst to him, when he's got his back to the lane, the last pin falls. Okay, now if you're observing this, how do you explain what just happened? And furthermore, can you predict how your friend will react when they find out that that last pin has fallen? Now you, like most people, will naturally appeal to mental states. You'll say things like, well, he wanted to throw a strike, he thought he didn't get one, and then you'll probably predict that when he sees that the last pin fell, you'll probably predict that he'll be really excited and you know, he'll smile. You'll predict all kinds of behaviors. Okay, so the idea, though, is that, you know, in making sense of the behavior, in terms of explaining and predicting the behavior, we seem to just naturally appeal to mental states like wants and thoughts. And so it's this ability that when I say theory of mind, I'm talking about this ability to explain and predict behavior in terms of mental states, like beliefs, desires, intentions, and things like that. And just sort of pre-theoretically and pre-empirically, this is something that we seem to do all the time, and we do it effortlessly. Right? Most of the time, you don't even realize that you're attributing mental states to other people. You know, occasionally we sort of dwell on it and we analyze it, like we just did with the bowling example. But most of the time, you know, you're not even aware that it's happening. Okay, so the first problem that I want to consider is whether social cues are sufficient for triggering the theory of mind system. So I'm going to call this the cue encoding hypothesis for theory of mind. And the basic idea is that there are these input conditions on the front end of the theory of mind system that have to be met. And when social cues, things like gaze cues, self-propulsion, morphological cues, when those cues match and then meet and exceed these input conditions, the theory of mind system is obligated to operate and generate mental state representations. Now, someone has told me that on first glance, this slide is not intuitive and it's not audience friendly. So I want to emphasize the following, that there are the cues, or if you want to call them the inputs, the stimuli, whatever. There are the input conditions or stimulus conditions or cue conditions, whatever you want to call them, and those are two separate things. The cues are out there in the world, or they're derived from information out there in the world, and the input conditions are inside the head. They're on the front end of the theory of mind system. You can kind of think of them as little cue detectors if you'd like. Okay? And the idea, again, is that these cues have to exceed the input conditions in order to trigger the system. Okay. So where does the cue encoding hypothesis kind of sit relative to various theories of cognition? So I think on most traditional views, this hypothesis is essentially incompatible and denied by most traditional theories, including Fodor's, who basically thinks that the mind is furnished with input systems and central systems. The input systems, which include things like the perceptual systems, and he thinks probably some parts of language processing, are thought to be modular. And for Fodor, modularity sort of softly entails automaticity, as well as cognitive impenetrability, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. So it seems that on these traditional views, because theory of mind is not an input system, it's a central system, and central systems are typically denied the properties of modules, that from that it follows that theory of mind isn't going to be automatic. It's not expected to be a Q-driven system. So in contrast to these traditional views, other cognitive scientists have argued that theory of mind is a kind of functionally specialized system, or it's supported by functionally specialized systems. And so these researchers, they draw on evidence from autism, from cognitive neuroscience, cognitive development, and they essentially argue that the evidence for theory of mind meets Fodor's criteria for modularity. And well, actually, what's sort of interesting about this is that if you follow the literature, Fodor himself recently seems to now be open to extending modularity to theory of mind, as we have kind of evolved on this over the past few decades. But most of the people who adopt Fodor's framework, and for that matter, most people who don't adopt his framework and adopt some other traditional view, they typically deny that theory of mind could be automatic because essentially it's not modular. There's sort of an interesting question here about whether you can have automaticity outside of a module, and that's sort of a separate issue. I don't see any principled reason why you couldn't, but that's sort of yet another issue to think about. Okay, and then sort of on the empirical side, there are a couple of reasons for thinking that there's at least some evidence out there that's consistent with the Q encoding hypothesis. One piece of evidence comes from Raymond Marr, who's here at York in the psychology department, and he's shown that using fMRI, that the bold response in the theory of mind network is modulated by the richness of social cues. So he has this study where people watch this movie. And in one condition, you watch the movie with real actors. And in a second condition, you watch that same movie, but it's in an animated version. I think they apply some kind of filter over the movie, so it kind of makes it into a cartoon. And it basically distorts the social cues. So I don't know how well you can see this, but the yellow frames are the real movie, and then the non-yellow framed still frames are the cartoon version. And what he shows is that the bold response in the theory of mind system is basically greater than the bold response in the theory of mind system is greater for the movies with the real people compared to the movies that have been made animated. And some other work that comes out of my old lab, this is also using fMRI. If you show people pretend scenarios, so people are acting and they're behaving in ways that are just sort of kind of in this, I guess, pretend context. They're not really doing the actions. And then you've got another condition where people are doing real actions. Again, what you see in the theory of mind network is greater activation for these pretend scenarios than the real scenarios. And what's sort of interesting about this particular task is that it was all done under covert conditions. So there's no instructions to track mental states in either condition. So that seems to suggest that the cues alone may be sufficient to activate that theory of mind network. And then one last piece of evidence I'll tell you about that I think is actually really compelling comes from research with adults who have been diagnosed with autism. And what's interesting about this study is that when you give this group of people a standard theory of mind task where they're instructed to track beliefs, they pass. They've got no trouble doing this. When you have them do the theory, when you have them watch a false belief scenario where there's no instructions to track mental states, and what you do is you measure their eye movements. The adults with autism don't make spontaneous eye movements that anticipate where the person will search based on their belief. So what this seems to suggest is that these adults with autism, they'll track belief when they're told to do it, and they don't do it when they're not told to do it. Okay, so the first study that I'm going to tell you about, against sort of this theoretical and empirical backdrop, the first study that I'm going to tell you about is designed to kind of test this Q encoding hypothesis. This work is, I should mention, it's an extension of work that was done by Ian Apperly. And what we did was we had people watch these movies that were basically false belief scenarios. But the participants were not given a false belief. They weren't given a theory of mind task. Okay, so all they were instructed to do was to track the location of an object in the movie. And they were told that at some point in the movie, the actress would give them a clue to help them find the object. And then at the very end of the movie, their task, which was really simple, was just to point where the object was really located. It could either be in one location on the left or one location on the right. So all they have to do is point to where the object is really located. There's one other instruction that they're given, which is that somewhere in the video, they're going to get a probe, a statement. And all they have to do is give a yes-no response to this statement. Okay, so these are, I'm going to show you frames from the video. So it kind of looks like this. I don't know how well you can see that, but basically there's a man and a woman, and the man shows the woman the content of these two containers. She then leaves the room, and while she's gone, the man moves an object, it's just a little marble, from one container to the other container. She then returns and gives a clue about where she thinks the object is by placing a marker on top of one of the two containers. Okay? Now what's important to realize at this point is that the clue is actually useless because the participant has already seen where the object is located. And in addition to that, the information she's giving is actually not useful. It's outdated now. So it's not even relevant to helping the subject do their explicit task. Then shortly after this, the video freezes and the participants get one of three different kinds of probes. They might get a belief probe, which is about the woman's mental state. So she thinks that the object is on the right, and you have to say yes or no. The participant could get a reality probe, which is about the location of the object. And so it might say something like, it is true that the object is on the right. And again, you say yes or no. And then most of these probes were actually filler probes with just random information like, it is true that the object switched locations, or it is true that the woman's wearing a black shirt. Okay, so after they give their response, the video resumes. When the video finishes, a blue frame appears around it, and that's the participants' that's their cue to then indicate where the object is really located. So they just then point to which side the object's really on. Are there any questions about, this task is kind of complicated, so are there any questions about how the task works? Is it relatively clear? Yeah, okay. So here's the logic. The idea is that in the overt reality condition, so these are the trials where the subject is getting a reality probe, and it's overt conditions because they've been told to track the location of the object. The idea is that when they first see the object somewhere around point B, because they've been told to track that information, they're going to form a representation of the object's location, and they're going to carry that through to the probe, because they've got this explicit task later on, right, where they have to point to the object's real location. So what this means is that when the probe arrives, that information about where the object is located is going to be readily available, because they've already formed a representation of it. And it predicts that the reaction time should be pretty fast to these reality probes. Now, in the covert belief condition, so these are the trials where participants get the belief probe, and the conditions are covert because, again, they've been given no instruction to track belief. There's two possibilities. So the first possibility is that the cues alone are insufficient to trigger processing. So the critical cue comes around point C. When the woman when she marks the container, that then affords a belief inference. And the question is, does that automatically trigger the belief inference or not? Under the cue insufficiency hypothesis here, H1 we'll call it, the cue is insufficient. And so what that means is that no representation is formed ahead of the probe. Okay, so when the probe appears, there's no representation in the system, that information isn't available, and the participant has to construct a representation of the woman's mental state on the fly. And that predicts that there's going to be a reaction time cost. So the idea here is that the response time to the belief probe should be slower than the response time to the reality probe. Okay, so that's one possibility. The second possibility is that the social cues are sufficient to trigger theory of mind processing. And so what that means is that when the woman marks the container, people use that information to then make an inference about her mental state. And they construct a representation that they then carry through to the probe. So now when the probe appears, that information is in the system, it's readily available, and when the belief probe appears, their response time should be relatively fast. And the prediction is that there should be essentially no difference between their response times to the belief probes and their response times to the reality probes. Okay? Are there any questions about the logic or the task? Okay. Okay. So what did we see? So here, yeah, sure.
Did you try also without adding it is true that to the beginning of the reality probe?
No. One of the difficulties about this is that you have to kind of match the two probes for linguistic features, the syntax, and the morphemes and things like that. So, what were you thinking that the syntax is kind of
I was just curious.
bizarre?
I realized why you were doing it. If you want to match that.
Is the worry that it's kind of a bizarre way to ask it, or?
No, I don't have
Oh, just wondering.
I don't have a coherent worry.
Oh,
I was
okay.
curious
Okay.
whether you also ran another condition.
No. You'll see, I'm going to tell you about a second experiment in a second where there's a kind of a nicer comparison between the belief probe and another condition. So, okay, so here's the data. So here are the reactions. So plotting reaction time along the y-axis. These are the reaction times to the reality probes. And the idea is that we're going to use this basically as a reference point to test our two hypotheses. So if cues are insufficient to trigger theory of mind processing, then that predicts that the reaction times for the belief condition should be higher than this bar, because they're going to be slower. And if the social cues are sufficient, that predicts that the reaction time should be about the same as the reaction times in the reality condition, or possibly even faster. And sure enough, that's what we see. So people are actually not just as good, but they're actually faster to respond to the belief probe, which seems to suggest that they're really putting the belief information, it's sort of very high priority information within the system. So this seems to suggest that they're picking up on the social cues and making inferences online, that it's a cue-driven process. Now, although this, I think, supports the queuing encoding hypothesis, there's actually a better test than comparing reality to belief, which is you can compare belief under these covert conditions to belief under overt conditions, right? So what's faster, when people have to make an inference about a belief when they're told to track it versus when people are told to track belief, when they're, how did I say that? When they're tracking a belief, when they're told to track it versus when they have to make an inference about belief and they're not told to track it. So that seems to be a cleaner comparison. And so in the second experiment, so that's significant. In the second experiment, that's what we looked at. We basically ran the same experiment, but now we ran it under overt conditions for belief. We told people to track the woman's mental state, and that at the very end of the video, they would have to point to where she thinks the object's located, not where it really is. Okay, and the idea is that we can now compare, under these conditions, their reaction times to the belief probe that comes midway through the movie. We can compare their reaction times under these overt conditions back to the reaction times from experiment 1 when they were answering these probes under covert conditions. Okay, so the logic is for this overt belief condition, when they're getting the belief probes and they've been instructed to track belief, the idea is that we can be quite certain that when they get the belief information right about here, that they're forming a representation, carrying it through to the probe, and they should be very quick to respond to the belief probes. And again, this data is on new subjects, and we're going to compare it back to the data from experiment 1. So in experiment 1, it's the same logic, right? Either people weren't tracking mental states online, the cues were insufficient to trigger processing, which predicts again that no representation will be constructed ahead of the probe. And it predicts that since they have to construct that representation on the fly when the belief probe appears, that they should be slower to respond to belief under covert conditions than the overt conditions. And the other possibility, of course, is that the system is cue-driven. So when they get the belief cue around point C, even though they haven't been instructed to track it, right? This is still the experiment 1 condition now. There's no instruction to track it, but if it's cue-driven, the representation gets encoded, carried through to the probe, and the prediction here is that there should essentially be little difference in the reaction times for overt versus covert conditions. Okay. Are there any questions on that logic? So really the same logic, but now it's kind of a bit cleaner because we're just comparing belief to belief, and the only thing that differs is the instruction set, whether to track it or not. Okay, so I'm plotting the response times to the belief probes under the overt conditions on your right, and so now we're going to use that as our reference point, right? So the question is, were the response times to the belief probes under the covert conditions slower than this, meaning that they probably weren't automatically tracking belief, or are they about as fast, or maybe even faster, suggesting that they were tracking them all along, even though there were no instructions to do so. And sure enough, there's actually, statistically, there's no difference between these two reaction times, and this was confirmed using a Bayesian analysis, where the analysis supports that the null is favored over the alternative, the null being that there's no difference between the two conditions. I'm not going to go into details about the Bayesian analysis right now, but if you want to know more about it, I can tell you later on. It's fairly straightforward, though. So this, and I should just mention, the reason why you do the Bayesian analysis is because if you do the traditional orthodox statistics, you can't support the null, and the whole point of this is to be able to provide evidence in favor of the null. Okay. So taken together, I think that the two experiments provide evidence for cue-driven processing, for the cue encoding hypothesis. But there are alternative explanations. And one of them was raised by Ian Apperly and his colleagues. And he points out correctly that because participants are getting multiple trials, so there's 60 trials total, 10% of them are belief conditions, where they're getting a belief probe. And what he points out correctly is that they're making these overt responses about belief, right? So they have to read this probe, and then they're making a judgment about somebody's mental state. So even though the conditions are overt with respect to the instruction set, they're not overt with respect to the responses. And so he says that, one possibility is that as the trials go by and they're making these overt responses, that kind of clues them in to the theory of mind element of the task. And so they start to spontaneously track the mental states. And so the claim is that it's hard to distinguish between the possibility of cue-driven processing and task-driven processing, because the overt responses is kind of a task feature that's in conjunction with the cues driving the processing. Okay, now I think the key thing to notice about this alternative explanation is that it only applies to trials after the first one, right? On the first trial, there are no trials that precede it that could possibly provide an overt response to kind of clue you in. So the way to address this alternative explanation is to run a first trial analysis. Look at the first trials before any overt response can have an effect on their behavior, on the participant's behavior. So what we did was we went back to experiment 1 and we went back to experiment 2 and we ran a first trial analysis. Statistically, we took a Bayesian approach because, again, we wanted to basically test whether the null is supported, the idea that there's no difference between the two conditions. And if there was evidence for that, we want to be able to support that. And we were testing that against this alternative that there is a cost to processing belief because it's not automatic. So this is I'm going to show you a slightly different representation. Basically, what this is showing you is that there's lots of overlap between the control data, which is, I think, the way I've entered into the analysis. So basically, the reality condition data and the belief condition data. And the way the Bayesian analysis interprets this is that there's essentially no difference between the first trial response times. And so the Bayesian analysis basically favors the null, which basically, as I was saying a second ago, the null in this case is that there's no difference in the response times on the first trials. So this seems to rule out the alternative explanation that it's these overt responses, this task feature that's driving the processing. Now, interestingly, when we do the same analysis for experiment 2, things come out quite different. The two curves are not overlapping, and that's actually statistically, it ends up supporting the alternative hypothesis. So when we compare the overt belief condition, right, when people are told to track the mental states, to the covert belief condition where there's no instruction to track it, and we only look at the first trial, people are slower in the covert condition. So on the second experiment, that alternative explanation gets some support. So the data is mixed, right? It's not clear. If we're going to be really conservative about this, we can say that for the Q encoding approach, you've got these input conditions. There are these cues that activate the system. And sort of the conservative interpretation of this is that there's at least support for spontaneous processing, and there's some evidence, some preliminary evidence that maybe the system is also Q-driven, that there's automatic processing. Are there any questions so far about the first two experiments? OK, so if you're not, if you don't find these first trial analyses too compelling, there's another solution to addressing this problem, this alternative explanation of overt responses. And the second solution is to just remove them entirely, right? And the way you would do that is you construct a task where there's no overt instructions to track belief, and there's also no overt responses that are related to theory of mind. So one way you can do that, so same situation as before. So one way you can do that is to use implicit response measures, like eye tracking. So you basically give the participant a task that's completely irrelevant to theory of mind. But while they're doing the task, they're watching, say, a false belief scenario, and you measure their eye movements. And the idea is that this implicit measure, you might be able to detect some theory of mind processing by their eye movements, even though they're doing an entirely different task, and they've been given entirely different instructions. OK. So what we did was we ran an implicit theory of mind task. And again, the idea is that it's implicit in sort of a couple of ways. There's no instructions to track belief, and there are no overt responses about mental states. All we're doing is telling the participants to watch this movie, this little animation, and that at the very end, they have a very simple task, which is just to indicate which box this boy is standing behind. OK? And while they're doing this, we're measuring their eye movements. And the idea is that, is it possible that participants are making eye movements that anticipate the behavior of this boy based on the boy's mental states? OK, so let me just show you how the task unfolds. So initially, there's just this opening phase where the boy puts a little object away in one container. It's usually a bunny or a frog. On half the trials, he leaves the room, creating a false belief scenario. And on half the trials, he stays in the room, creating a true belief scenario. So in this particular case, I'm showing you a false belief scenario. While he's out of the room, the object switches locations, or while he's in the room on the true belief scenarios, the object switches locations. He then returns, and there's sort of this phase, it's called our anticipation phase, where the boy just sort of walks forward and he waits. And that goes on for about 3 seconds. Okay, and then we put up a crosshair, and then finally, what we do is we show them a frame, a still frame, and the boy's either standing behind the left location or the right location. Now, and they're told to make a button press to indicate which side he's on. So it's a really simple spatial location task. Now, there are a couple of things that are important to note. As I've already said, there's no instructions to track belief. They're not making any overt responses that have to do with tracking the boy's mental state. One of the other things that's key about this task is that the side that the boy ends up on in the response phase, that final frame, is completely random. So 50% of the time he's on the left, 50% of the time he's on the right, and it's completely decoupled from all the events that happened before it. So even if people sort of spontaneously start to, they spontaneously think, oh, maybe he's acting on behalf of his mental states, and they start to track his mental states, that won't help them in any way for doing the explicit task of just indicating which side he's on. So what we were interested in, what we were measuring, were their eye movements over this window here. And so the idea is that during this this time window, participants might be making eye movements that anticipate where the boy will search based on his belief. Okay? So to break this down by the two condition types that we have. So in the true belief condition, the object ends up on, this is during this analysis window, okay? So during the analysis window in the true belief condition, the object is, say, on the right side, and because the boy has a true belief, he thinks it's in that location, the actual object location. In the false belief conditions, the object, say, is on the right side, but because he was out of the room when the switch happened, he falsely thinks that the object is still in the empty location, okay? What we do here now is we compute what we call a looking preference score. And this score can range from 1 to -1. A score of 1 means that during this anticipation phase, during that analysis window that I just showed you, a score of 1 means that they spend all of their time looking at the object location. And a score of -1 means they spend all of their time looking at the empty location. And a score of 0 means they divide their time up between the two locations. Okay, so there's a looking preference score, and essentially the numbers map on as I just described. Okay, so what are the predictions? Now, in the true belief condition, the idea is that participants are going to spend most of their time, if they're tracking belief, they're going to spend most of their time making anticipatory eye movements to the object location, because that's where the boy thinks it is. Now, the true belief condition is of limited use, right? Because they could also be looking at the object location simply because the object is physically there. So the critical condition is the false belief condition. In the false belief condition, these two things come apart. The object is in one location, and the boy's belief is pointing at the, figuratively pointing at the other location. And so the idea is that in the false belief condition, the looking preference score should move away from the object location and towards the empty location. So this score should basically, using true belief as a reference point, the looking preference score should come down in the false belief condition. Okay? Are there any questions on how the task is working in the logic? Okay? Okay. So what do we see? As expected in the true belief condition, this isn't very surprising. The participants are mostly looking at the object location. But as I mentioned before, it's kind of ambiguous, right? They could be looking there because the object is there or because the boy thinks the object is there. The critical condition, as I mentioned before, is this false belief condition. And as predicted on the Q encoding hypothesis, the looking preference score comes down. It seems like their eye movements are being pulled away from the object location and towards that empty location because they're tracking the boy's belief, and they're anticipating where he's going to search based on his false belief. And this is it's actually very significant, as you can see. Okay, so what are some alternative explanations? Now, one thing that might have occurred to you is that participants are seeing these animations multiple times. There's about, I think, 40 trials in the session. And so you might wonder whether, after enough trial exposures, they just sort of spontaneously generate this hypothesis that, well, maybe the boy is going to the location where he thinks it is, right? They have this spatial location task, and maybe they're just trying to figure out a strategy for solving that task. And so they figure, okay, well, he's going to go to the location where he thinks it is. Now, keep in mind, like I've already told you, the side that the boy ends up on is completely random. That strategy won't work. But maybe they sort of stumble upon this hypothesis and they try it out. Okay, so the idea here is that after a certain amount of time, they stumble upon this hypothesis, and it makes the prediction that later in the session, the participants should make more anticipatory belief-based eye movements in the second half of the session than early in the session, right? It takes a certain number of trials to come upon this strategy. So the prediction would be something like this. Early on in the session, say the first 20 trials, there's hardly any difference between the true and the false belief conditions. Participants basically are just, maybe they're just tracking the object. Whatever it is, they're not tracking belief yet. And it's not until later on in the session that you see the effect, that their eye movements start getting pulled away from the object location to the empty location, the belief-based location in the false belief condition. Okay? So this is just sort of splitting the effect up by the first two trials. That's what you might predict on this alternative explanation. The actual results are, in fact, just the opposite. So people seem to be tracking belief early on, and then later on the effect gets a little bit weaker. So that seems to undermine this first alternative explanation. Now, you could say in response, as a second alternative explanation, well, maybe they don't need many trial exposures. Maybe they start trying out the hypothesis right away that the kid is searching where he thinks the object is. Okay? And on that hypothesis, on this alternative explanation, you should predict that they're making these anticipatory eye movements early on, and then once they realize that it doesn't work, because it doesn't work, they abandon the strategy. And so in the second half of the session, there's really no, they're not making these anticipatory eye movements. This is a hard alternative explanation to beat. I think I'm a little suspicious about it, though, because it seems to me that it starts to approximate the Q encoding hypothesis. You have to start to wonder, what is it about those first few trials that cues in the subject to start tracking belief? And it seems to me that the most obvious answer is that it's the social cues. But it's sort of open. It's still a possibility that they are spontaneously coming onto this hypothesis and then abandoning it early on. Okay, so just to kind of recap the first three experiments, we've systematically removed explicit instruction. We systematically removed the explicit responses in the eye tracking and looking at the first trial analyses in experiments 1 and 2. And we've also systematically removed trial frequency, or we've controlled for it by looking at the first trials in experiments 1 and 2, but also doing this first half for second half session analysis. And it seems, I mean, taken together, the evidence seems to suggest that social cues are sufficient for triggering processing. Now, I just want to remind you a point that I made way earlier, which is that this doesn't mean that theory of mind is always triggered by just the social cues. There are probably lots of cases where someone explicitly prompts you to think about, what was Romney thinking last night and the debate, and you start generating these explanations to reconcile his views of reality or whatever, right? So, you can certainly engage theory of mind via other minimum conditions, right? Instruction, maybe task-driven ways. But what this seems to suggest is that at least one of those ways, cues alone can be sufficient. Okay, so, right, so taken together, it seems to provide some evidence for the Q encoding hypothesis. So I told you early on that I think there's principled reasons for considering automaticity and cognitive impenetrability together. And so I want to turn to cognitive impenetrability now. Okay, so the basic idea with cognitive impenetrability is that high-level knowledge, like your beliefs and your goals, can influence the internal processing of a system. The system is in some sense sealed off from outside information. What did I want to give you guys as an example? Okay, right, so there's lots of classic visual illusions, right, where you might know that two objects are actually the same size, but you can't help but observe them as being different sizes, right? So your top-down knowledge just can't influence your low-level vision. So that's the idea behind cognitive impenetrability. And what I want to consider is, why should we consider these two properties of a system together? I want to argue that for any system, it's embedded in a much larger system, right? Any cognitive system is interacting with lots of other systems. And there's only two avenues for all that other information to affect a given system. One way is via sort of a bottom-up, cue-driven route, and the other way is via sort of a top-down knowledge route. And so the cue-driven part sort of addresses that bottom-up route, and cognitive impenetrability sort of addresses the top-down route. So when we're thinking about all the ways in which a system can be interacted with, it really comes down to these two avenues. And so I want to call cases where only bottom-up cues can trigger the system, and high-level knowledge is essentially impenetrable. That conjunction of those, the conjunction of those two properties, I'm going to call a cognitive reflex. Now, you can imagine lots of other combinations, right? A system could be cue-driven and cognitively penetrable. Fodor would probably think that all central systems are that of that nature. You can imagine a system that's just cognitively penetrable but not Q-driven, maybe certain simulation systems that you might have in your head. You can imagine a system that's not Q-driven and not cognitively penetrable, maybe a system that's been damaged, or maybe under certain very extreme conditions, a mechanism just sort of seals itself off and it doesn't operate, right? It's a possibility. So for these two particular cases where it's Q-driven and impenetrable, we'll call that a cognitive reflex. And now I'm going to consider a case where we test the cognitive penetrability part of the conjunction. So the idea here is that what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to show you another eye tracking study that has the same form as the one that I just showed you. The one manipulation is that we tell people up front that all of the information preceding that final screen when they make their judgment about what side the kid is standing on, all that information is irrelevant. So they're getting information that the social cues can be ignored. The idea is that on the cognitive penetrability hypothesis, knowing that information essentially blocks the mental state computation. Okay? On the cognitive impenetrability hypothesis, the idea is that even when you provide them with those instructions, that they can essentially ignore all the information, all the cues that come before the final frame. It's irrelevant, it won't help you, it's completely random. The idea is that even when they know that they can't ignore the social cues, that these cues activate the system and generate mental state representations. So again, like I said, I mean, it's the same task, we just changed the task set. This is data that's still being collected, but what you see is that, as you would expect in the true belief condition, people are looking towards the object location either because they think that, they're tracking the boy's mental state, that he thinks it's there, or maybe simply because the object is there. And as before, the key condition is the false belief condition. So what happens here? Do they start making these anticipatory eye movements to where the boy thinks the object is located, even though we just told them there's no point in doing that? Sure enough, they do. It seems like they just can't help but track the mental state of the boy. They can't help but sort of make those anticipatory eye movements. They just can't turn it off. And so far, I mean, the sample size is quite small. I actually have a lot more new data, and I just didn't have time to analyze it. But so far, it's significant, and the effect size is quite large. OK, so this seems to provide evidence for the impenetrability of the theory of mind system under these testing conditions, where essentially these social cues, or the instruction to ignore the social cues, just doesn't penetrate the system. So the cues impinge on the system, the mental states are generated, and they kind of push around the eye movements. OK, so taken together, we've got this cognitive reflex hypothesis, which is the conjunction of these two sub-hypotheses, what I've called the Q encoding hypothesis and the cognitive impenetrability hypothesis. We've seen that the front end of the theory of mind system has got these input conditions, right, our little cue detectors. And when the social cues are present, whether they be gaze cues, this is probably just a small subset of the cue matrix that I was alluding to earlier. There's probably lots of cues that are relevant to the system. But when these cues exceed whatever thresholds are being set by the input conditions, the theory of mind system is obligated to run and generate these mental state representations. And then, of course, the other part of the reflex hypothesis is that there are going to be cases where that top-down knowledge just can't penetrate the system and influence the internal procedures of the mechanism. OK, now I want to consider just a couple of implications of this work for cognitive development and cognitive architecture. So you might be familiar with a lot of the work that's come out of cognitive development lately in theory of mind, where there are now a bunch of studies that seem to show that infants are sensitive to the belief states of agents. And the evidence comes in two forms. There are these studies where basically babies are surprised, as indicated by looking time, when an agent acts in a way that's inconsistent with their beliefs. Okay? The other piece of evidence is that studies with infants and toddlers show that they'll make the anticipatory eye movements just like our adults do when you give them these theory of mind scenarios. So they basically try to anticipate where someone will search based on their belief. And that's revealed through their eye movements. Now, there's been a bit of a controversy about how to interpret this data. There are the rich interpretations, which say that what they're doing is that they're actually attributing mental states And then there have been sort of these more deflationary accounts, which basically say we shouldn't grant the kids sort of this rich conceptual knowledge. Rather, what they're doing is they're employing these behavioral rules. And by the way, so here are just some of the papers. But okay, so the cognitive reflex hypothesis, I think it provides at least a mechanistic account of how babies, without any language, without much knowledge of the world, how they might be able to do these tasks in a more kind of rich way. That is, so long as the cues are sufficiently rich in the scenarios that they're observing, and they meet and exceed the input conditions on the theory of mind system, infants might truly be deploying mental state, they might truly be deploying theory of mind in the rich sense of attributing mental states. Because in a way, the system, when it's behaving in this sort of reflexive way, all it depends on are the social cues. That's not to rule out that they don't use behavioral rules. They may be using that in conjunction with mental state interpretations of behavior. But at least this seems to provide one way in which that might be happening. And then some implications for cognitive architecture. I mean, someone, I forget who pointed this out, but someone pointed out that the title modularity of mind is a bit of a misnomer, right? Fodor is only attributing modularity to a small part of the mind, the input systems. And so this kind of puts the mind back in modularity of mind. It seems to suggest that central systems may actually inherit some of the properties of modules. They may actually be automatic and cognitively impenetrable. So maybe we should extend modularity up to the central systems. I think the data also sort of challenges the idea of a cognition-perception boundary, that there's a hard division between these two things. It's not at all obvious to me anymore what the principal difference is between cognition and perception, other than where they get their inputs from, right? Perception gets their inputs from the transducers, cognition gets its inputs from perceptual systems and other cognitive systems. But other than that, it's not clear to me what turns on this distinction, and I'm not sure what the value is of keeping it around. So maybe, you know, maybe this distinction is a distinction in name only. And then one final thing I just want to sort of throw out there. I'm not really sure how to think about it myself, but maybe people have some thoughts. I've been wondering if there are any entailment relationships between automaticity and domain specificity. So if a system is automatic, does it follow that it's specialized? Or is it the case that the more automatic a system is, the more specialized it is? I have some intuitions about it, but I've had a hard time formalizing those intuitions. So maybe some people have some thoughts on that. OK, one last thing that I want to do, and I'll stop. I just want to plug a talk that I'm giving in a few weeks in the Social and Personality Psychology Colloquium. I'm doing some work in collaboration with Joni Sasaki, who's a social psychologist. And so we're starting a new field that merges social psychology and cognitive science called social cognitive science. And this is well, we're not really starting a new field, but at least this project is sort of at the intersection of these two areas. And we've been interested in how culture might affect attention shifting. And so kind of continuing the penetrability theme, the talk is going to be about whether culture can essentially penetrate low-level social attention systems. So that's on Monday, November 5th, if you can make it. And ignore that. And so these are, just to mention my collaborators, I've had a lot of help and a lot of good advice from people. So just wanted to acknowledge them. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Adam. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
We have a tradition where we invite the students to ask the first question.
Oh, yeah, for
so
sure.
If you don't mind, we'll continue doing that.
OK, right on.
Student questions. And you'll need to speak into the microphone.
Oh, okay. I'll attempt to try to answer that question you said about the, is it more domain specific?
Uh-huh.
I would say that it probably would be more domain specific, because I figure that there's probably older, in an evolutionary sense, those cognitive systems probably developed in pro-simians and in simians, and it carried across the genetic phyla over time. And if those systems in pre-human animals allowed, through natural selection, allowed them to survive so that our species could, you know, come into being and be successful, I would say that they would be the most highly specialized, I feel, at all. And the automaticity would come in because they probably would be conditioned through basic instinctual survival responses. Probably they are neurocognitively related to that too. Like, for example, midbrain reflexes could come up through the thalamus, and they could, in some cases, there could be inhibitory responses from, say, the orbital frontal region. In other cases, they could actually be disinhibited if there were certain survival mechanisms that had to occur very, very quickly. And as you mentioned, since humans, we are a social animal as well, it shows why picking up on social cues would be linked to pertinent survival impulses. Like, someone could tell if another member of the tribe was going to harm them or was a potential mate or whatever. These things, the need for social cue discrimination would become very, very fine over our prehistorical development. Mm-hmm. And I was also, just last thing, I was thinking of Piaget, where he spoke about how ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, and I was thinking too that even if that was partially correct, if you were to have, say, a baby or a young child, would probably be able to access those more central modules in a more primordial way, just say at that level of their nascent development, that may become later on more inhibited by social acculturation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on that second point, I mean, there might be something to that where part of development is sort of getting a handle on systems that are otherwise automatic, or you might think of as sort of more low level in their operation. So that's an interesting observation. I mean, I wonder too about sort of you bring up phylogeny, whether it follows from things being evolutionary ancient, whether it follows that they have to be domain-specific, one, and secondly, whether they have to be automatic, whether you could have systems that have evolved that are actually much more general purpose in their processing profile and potentially not even automatic. But I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here. I am kind of sympathetic to the evolutionary perspective. But yeah, those are all interesting points, yeah.
I just wanted to ask about your experiment, which was well planned, especially the latter part where you try to show that it's cognitively not penetrable. You might complete it by going back to the social cue and making those social cues ambiguous to see if you get a statistical response from that.
Yeah.
So instead of having a face, remove the eyes. In another case, remove the face, make a triangle, walk up, or some other geometrical figure, so it makes it ambiguous whether it's social or not. Yeah. And then if it is a social cue, you should see an immediate effect in the time response.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. There are other people who have done similar things, kind of outside a theory of mind experiment, where they've kind of, essentially they've manipulated the richness of the social cues, and they essentially find that, how did those experiments go? So they were categorizing objects as agents or not, and they found that people were more likely to categorize objects as agents when they sort of exhibited particular cues, like they exhibited contingent motion, or if they were self-propelled. And you can kind of show that, how people categorize things as agents or not are very sensitive to the richness of the kinds of social cues they give out. And my guess is that you don't attribute mental states to anything other than things that have already been categorized as agents. So I think your intuition is right on. If we play around with the social cues, we should see downstream effects in the theory of mind processing. I think that's probably spot on, yeah.
So I was trying to think of cases where you'd think there's definitely not, things that are not a cognitive reflex. and to compare them to the case you considered. So take something like forming a judgment about whether somebody should be admitted to your graduate program. Right, so presumably if anything's not a cognitive reflex, right, that's not a cognitive reflex. But I was worried that you could get the same results you get in that sort of a case, which is highly influenced by pragmatics, right, and all sorts of other things. So, for example, I read a letter of recommendation that says, that Jones has excellent penmanship, and then I just automatically infer that Jones should not be admitted, right, to our, right, that's all the letter says. It just says Jones has excellent penmanship. And so I automatically infer that Jones should not be admitted to our program, right, just on the basis of that. Right, so it just seems like, the situation there is just automatically going to lead me to that conclusion. And I was worried also that, in the experiment you described where the person comes in and puts a marker on one of them, I was thinking, that's sure. I mean, the person sitting there watching them put a marker, and they're thinking, well, why would they be doing that? Now I'd better draw an inference about what's going on, right? There's got to be some reason they're doing that. And so it's, so in a way you didn't give them explicit instructions, but the pragmatics of the situation causes them to automatically attribute a belief. And then on the penetrability. Okay, so we'll start with that.
Yeah, I have a very terrible memory. So regarding that second point, while it's fresh in my mind, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's something about seeing that placing of the marker, right? But then when we start to flesh that out, we say that it's the pragmatics. Well, I mean, in terms of the front end of the system, is it sensitive to pragmatics, and what does that mean in terms of, very mechanistically, what's it picking up on? Well, I mean, there might be certain things where it's, trying to figure out, well, okay, the person's made a signal over here, but the object is over here. And right, so maybe it's saying, okay, well, these two things are incongruent, and then that triggers the processing. But then, what is the system operating over? Well, it's still operating over sort of her behavioral cue, where the object really is. I mean, it seems to me that these are all things, when you decompose them, are legitimate things that would end up being inputs to the system. And so, pragmatics is sort of a very high-level way of looking at the situation. But I wonder when we start to decompose it into what the system is sensitive to, that it actually just boils down to more social cues.
So do you think that it's automatic when I read a letter that says Jones has excellent penmanship, and then I just automatically conclude that Jones shouldn't be admitted to our graduate program? Okay,
right. So so coming back to that one. So I mean, I wonder what you mean when you say you automatically conclude that he should or shouldn't be. I mean, are you saying that you're getting sort of an immediate, kind of an emotional response? And
so I mean that. If so I see this letter of recommendation, and then you didn't even have to instruct me to draw conclusions about whether Jones should be admitted to our graduate program, right? Or whether Jones is academically gifted, right? So you could do two conditions. So we could run an experiment like yours. We have two conditions, one where we tell you from the beginning, right, to think about whether Jones should be admitted. Another where we don't. And then I'm thinking, are you going to see a difference in reaction time? My guess is no, because you just are automatically, just by virtue of being presented with that letter, are going to draw this inference. So my worry was that you'd get the same reaction time data that you get.
Yeah. So I mean, I mean,
it's an empirical question.
Yeah. I have to sort of speculate on it because we'd have to go out and test it. But for somebody like yourself, who is a faculty member, and you have presumably some experience with this, I don't think it is that crazy to say that there are at least some processes, some decision processes that have already been sort of due to your history, your environmental history as a professor, that you've sort of learned up potentially some decision rules that look at the data and just make split decisions on it. And that's not to say that there aren't other ways to then look at, to sort of revise that decision in light of sort of maybe more top-down considerations. But I actually don't think it's way out there for somebody who has that background experience. Now, another question is, well, what if you show a first-year college student, okay, who maybe doesn't have any sort of practice with this, and they haven't sort of developed expertise in making these decisions? Then I'd be more skeptical about whether they could, in a sense, come to an automatic judgment.
Right. So can I ask one more question, which is just,
please.
So suppose I read a study that says that letters of recommendation are just awful predictors of scholarly aptitude. Right. So now I've been told, just like in your ladder experiment, that disregard this evidence. This evidence is not relevant. Right. So where the person thinks it is, it's not going to tell you where the object's going to show up. Right. So the letters are irrelevant.
Yeah.
And then I go and I read this letter that says Jones has excellent penmanship, but that's all it says. Do you think I could just turn it off so I wouldn't automatically infer that Jones is scholarly inept? And right. And if I can't, does that show that that decision is impenetrable?
So I mean, this is a whole other domain, right? So now we're outside theory of mind.
Yeah.
But whatever domain we're looking at now, this sort of expertise that you've developed, to the extent that you can't turn it off, that does suggest that there are at least some programs in your head that maybe they coexist with other programs that do sort of the more contemplative, reflective processing. But there's at least some programs in your head that can't be turned off. They make those quick, instantaneous, automatic judgments just based on the information you're providing it. And you know what you were sort of setting up here kind of reminds me a little bit of tests that have been run with physicists. Okay, now physicists are experts. They've got all this knowledge about how the physical world works. But when you give them these various tasks that sort of probe their naive physics, and they have intuitions about the way objects should move about the world, people have naive physics knowledge that does not correspond to how the world really works. And even professional physicists, academic physicists, fall prey to these naive physics intuitions. They can't seem to be able to override them, even though they've got all this, this other body of knowledge, this scientific body of knowledge that doesn't seem to be able to penetrate this naive physics knowledge that they have that sort of leads them to these incorrect intuitions about the world. So I don't know, I guess that's just sort of a comment on top of that.
It was meant to be a reductio, but you endorsed the...
Yeah, I guess I don't think it's absurd. I accept the absurd conclusion. Yeah.
I do have a list here of names, and I'm just going to be delivering the microphone around. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand at some time. I'll put you on the list. Okay.
Yeah. So your idea that the application, one of the applications of your thesis that mind reading is reflexive is that you're able to explain how it is that 15-month-olds are able to pass these false mind reading tests, right? Mm-hmm. But my impression of that literature was we don't just want something that explains how those 15 months are doing this, but also explains it in a way such that 3.5-year-olds and 4-year-olds wouldn't be passing Sally Ann. Mm-hmm. So it seems like if this is reflexive, I don't understand why they would be failing that test.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. So the way that I've been thinking about this, I have a separate project line that pretty much gets at exactly that issue. Why do really young babies look so precocious? Why do the 3-year-olds look, incompetent in comparison to the infants? And then why do they all of a sudden get smart again when they're 4, right? And if it's reflexive, then why aren't the 3-year-olds performing up to level with everyone else? And one of the key differences is that the tasks are quite a bit different, right? So the 3-year-olds are being given these verbal tasks, and that's a game changer, I think. So the verbal tasks, first off, they introduce lots of other demands. So I think there's additional performance demands that essentially interfere with or sort of mask the competence that they actually have. And I've been working on actually another idea, which is that around this age, you've got language systems that are developing, you've got theory of mind systems that are developing, and at least one possibility is that the two systems haven't hooked up yet. That there's essentially a kind of disconnection between the two systems. So the theory of mind system can operate on its own and it can push around eye movements, but when it comes to generating a verbal response, it just can't get the information over to the language system. And so when you try to tap the system via a verbal response, you're not going to get any signal that they're actually attributing mental states. But it's misleading because there's a sense in which the systems haven't hooked up yet. So I guess I think that you can have that cognitive reflexive system in place and still be able to explain the difficulties of the 3-year-olds. Some other people have tried to explain it in terms of two systems, there being an implicit system and an explicit system, but that seems to me just a redescription of the data, and I don't know what to, I don't know, I'm a little suspicious of it.
Hi, I'm curious about why you've set automaticity and impenetrability as though they were binary distinctions. It strikes me as that there's a spectrum, and I'm coming at this from the sense of doing personal change work with people, where and not just theory of mind, but people normally come in with they have some sort of behavior that's triggered automatically that's destructive or counter to what they want to do in life, and I help teach them how to have a different reaction, which might become then cognitively penetrable. In other words, say, where their reaction to the stimulus is, stop, think about what you're doing. Or it might be an automatic, feel good about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with respect to the front end of the system, thinking about the cue-driven route to activating the system, as I was trying to emphasize in the talk, that I mean, I actually do think it's possible that under some conditions it might be automatic or cue-driven, and under other conditions there might be other ways of activating the system that, where the cues alone aren't sufficient. So I'm certainly on board with that, and I agree that even in the case where it's automatic, it could be to some degree, right? To what extent is it automatic? It might vary quite a lot. I think one of the real subtle points of looking at this is wondering, okay, so if we think about cognitive impenetrability, I give you some information and we want to see whether it affects processing. One thing that's really hard to tease apart is whether that information is actually influencing the internal operations of the system you're interested in, or whether it's acting after the fact, after the system's outputted information, and now there's manipulations on those representations. And that's a really hard thing to tease apart. So you could have basically impenetrability, but yet still have these kinds of flexibilities and responses and behaviors, but they come kind of after the system's handled the information. And it's a hard thing to tease apart.
I mean, one problem with domain specificity and the whole definition of it is, since there's no sort of natural delimitation of domains, anytime someone says, well, we've got a domain-specific system for X, and then someone tries to refute that by showing, oh, well, no, actually, it can also do Y, someone can come back and say, well, okay, so it's domain-specific for X and Y, right? I mean, suppose I say, well, I have a domain-specific system for theory of mind, and someone says, well, actually, we use it to do narrative comprehension as well. And someone says, well, actually, theory of mind and narrative comprehension I think of as the domain, and so it's domain-specific after all, right? Yeah. So there's always that kind of a grain problem whenever you've got domain specificity. So, and one thing that strikes me is maybe actually the only sense that we can make of domain specificity that's worth the name is something more like your notion of automaticity. And so I was wondering, what you thought of that. But the other thing is, I'm kind of puzzled by, I mean, I thought you were going to say that this is a trichotomy between, instruction-driven, cue-driven, and
task-driven.
Task-driven. But what do we say about a system? I mean, if we take seriously your reinterpretation of the results of experiments 1 and 2, that is good when it's cue-driven, and it's even better when it's instruction-driven, right? I mean, that seems to be the upshot, as far as I can tell from the experiments, right? Is it beginning to sort of maybe decompose a bit into maybe more than one system? Could there be not just a single monolithic TOM, but several different capacities that we're drawing on here that, when we give them instruction, it works even better than when we just give it a cue or something like that. So 2 questions.
Yeah, so to do the second question first, the way I had been thinking about it was that the theory of mind system is basically entering into different states. So, or any system for that matter could enter into different states where in one state it's basically cue-driven, something due to whatever, some set of affairs, it enters a different state, and under those conditions it's task-driven, enters a third state potentially, and is instruction-driven. So it's kind of state shifting. But that's another possibility, that instead of thinking of it as sort of different states of one system, you actually have a multiplicity of systems. I think that's absolutely possible. I think it's completely consistent with all the data that I've presented. Regarding the first point about domain specificity, so I've been thinking about this a lot lately as well, and I think you're spot on that I think the idea that domain specificity and domain generality is a, as a binary option is just a fiction. I think that it's basically a degree thing, and I don't know that I agree that there's not a way to find the natural divisions between what the domain is. I think if you formalize domain in terms of function, you get some traction on it. And I agree that if you show that the system actually not only does it do A, it does B, in some sense what you're now saying is that the system is maybe a little bit less specialized than you thought. It's doing not just A, but A and B. And that's always an empirical question about how much ground can that system cover. But it seems to me that when you couch things in terms of function, everything will be functionally specialized, but to different degrees. Right? Because you could think of something like executive function, which seems to be just about as, what people would say is domain general as you can get. But it does have a function, right? I mean, it's doing things like inhibition. I mean, it probably has lots of subfunctions, but one of them is inhibition, inhibitory control. And that's a function. It just seems to operate over lots of domains. It doesn't discriminate amongst domains. So that's one thing. I think we can maybe formalize domain specificity in terms of functional specialization. But I'm not actually ready to abandon the idea of content specificity either. I do think that maybe we should preserve that notion, because there is a sense in which systems can be functionally specialized, but actually quite content general, like executive function. Or they could be quite functionally specialized and content specialized. So for example, I would think that face processing is both very narrowly specialized for operating over things that have the geometric configuration of a face. So that's its function, but sort of inherent in that is that it's looking over fairly narrow content, right? It's just face cues and things like that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say, but I guess I endorse that first idea that it's, specialization is going to come in different shades. But I don't know that I would say that there's not natural divisions. Yeah.
I have a follow-up, actually.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So on Max's question that of whether or not there could be a couple of systems, and your response that maybe there's just one system that has multiple modes. What's really the difference between having one system that operates in different ways under different circumstances and actually having two systems? And what would decide between those competing hypotheses?
Yeah, well, I was thinking that in the typical case, the output of those two arrangements are going to be pretty similar, but their breakdown, it should look quite different, right? If there's one system and it gets one system that enters into different states, you would predict that someone who's got impairment to that system, there's essentially no way to then activate the system, right? You lose all three. If there are multiple systems, you would predict in a case of breakdown that you could selectively knock out one or the other or the other.
Couldn't you have a breakdown of just one mode of the system?
Potentially, that would sort of get sort of a more fine-grained issue of when you're looking inside the system. I wonder if then that's just a redescription of the other position, which is that once you look inside the system, if there are sort of discrete subroutines for each of those different modes of operation, then that seems to me to sort of approximate the other position. But if somehow those things aren't decomposable, that it's just one system and it can't be decomposed, that would suggest that you should see a very different breakdown pattern. But I think you're right in terms of output, they should look pretty similar. That would be my guess. I mean, who knows? You could imagine things being wired up in all kinds of ways. Maybe there's some efficiency gain from having multiple systems. You don't have to state shift. I don't know. It's one of those things that, to me, it seems I don't have very strong kind of pre-theoretical ideas about differences in behavior, but I can imagine them.
Okay, so is what it takes for it to be two distinct systems is just that those if it's one system, then if one of the modes goes awry, then they all go awry.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
my turn, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, thanks. You gave me a lot to think about. I have questions about experiment 1 and 2, about whether they might, in fact, be instruction-driven. And I have questions about experiment 3 and 4, about whether they're really theory of mind tests.
Yeah.
So, the first part of the question. The reason why I think it might be instruction-driven is because the difference, as I recall, between your task and Ian Apperly's original task is the use of the marker, right? Is that right?
There's a change in the order of the events so that the marking in my version happens later.
Later, okay.
Yeah.
All right, right. Because I'm wondering about the role of the marker. How, if that's what changed the results from there not being a significant difference to there being a significant difference in the reality probe versus the belief probe, then it makes me really wonder what role this marker is playing in this case. And one role it might possibly be playing is a kind of symbolic role, right? And the participants are given the instructions that you're going to be given a clue about where the object is. And so when the woman is putting the marker on the object, right, that is a symbol that they might be interpreting as if it is a linguistic symbol. I believe it's here. I believe the object is here. So it's not, it wouldn't be automatic just by looking in the way that you were describing, like movement towards an object or looking at something. It involves a symbolic cue that the participants were told to look for. So is that, why should we not think there's an instruction-driven aspect in that task?
So I mean, that's actually an interesting point. I mean, in some sense, the marker could be just kind of a non-verbal instruction. You're kind of in some way, you're conveying something, right? You're giving them a clue. But so what I wonder is that even in that case, I mean, I think to us as theory of minders, you know, we just can't help but take that clue and make that extra inference that the person thinks it's there. But I really wonder, you know, if you take a person who's been diagnosed with autism, I really wonder how they see that marker. Because you would predict that, well, I don't know, actually. It'd be hard to see what the predictions would be based on your proposal. It's not so clear now that I think about it. But one thing that I wonder is just in how they interpret that marker. Do they see that as sort of being a premise to then making an inference about the person's mental state, right? So what I have in mind, let me tell you what I have in mind. So there are these studies that Simon Baron-Cohen did a while ago where it's called the Charlie task, and you basically put a face in the middle of the screen, and you put 4 kinds of candy in the corners of the screen. And he asked the kid, so Charlie, the little face in the center, it's looking at one of the 4 corners, okay? And you ask the kid, a healthy kid and a kid with, who's been diagnosed with autism, you ask him, well, which candy is Charlie looking at? The healthy kids correctly say he's looking at whatever it is, the Milky Way. And the kids who are diagnosed with autism, they have no trouble with it. They correctly say the kid is looking at, Charlie is looking at the Milky Way. Then when you ask them, which candy does Charlie want, okay? Typically developing kids have no trouble. They easily make the inference from looking to wanting. The kids with autism don't make this tiny little inferential step. They're at chance. They say that he's just as likely to pick one of the other 3 candies as the 4th candy. So I just wonder, you know, even though for us, I mean, it seems like we can't help but sort of interpret that as an instruction or whatever it might be, it still seems to me that under even those conditions, it still requires that very tiny inferential step to see it as a kind of, to see it as an instruction. And I guess you could then kind of push, what I would do is I would now push me to say, well, when you give verbal instructions, isn't that just basically theory of mind? Aren't you making them sort of, you know, understand some element of the task?
I don't know if that's what I would say, but you're giving them something, and I don't know what that something is, right? And the reason why I like picked up on this is because I was asking Laura, who's a grad student working in grade 8 cognition, about this. There's some tasks that have been done with grade 8s where when they're given markers to symbolize something, they're better at it than when they're not given markers. So there's some role that I wouldn't want to say in the 8 cases that indicates anything about theory of mind, but plays some role that we need to figure out what the role is.
Yeah,
I don't
and
know what it is.
in fact, I think that task was borrowed from primate cognition originally, right, with the marker. Wasn't that Joseph Call's original task?
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually make a really good point. I mean, it could be construed as a kind of nonverbal instruction to track mental states. Yeah, I think that's certainly on the table. I'll have to think more about it.
Can I ask you about the second too?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So in those experiments, I was wondering if you really have two combined hypotheses there about what's going on, because you say they're anticipating behavior of the boy based on his mental states. And that based on his mental states, or you said later, based on his beliefs, that's something that you didn't empirically test for. You tested for anticipation of behavior. But as you said at the end, because we have many different ways of anticipating behavior, why think that the boy's anticipating behavior on the base, or the subject is anticipating the boy's behavior on the basis of any kind of theory of mind reasoning? And that relates to all the alternative hypotheses that have been given for the infant eye tracking experiments that Perner and Ruffman and others have provided.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. All of that data is perfectly compatible with the possibility that they're using rules to predict and, in this case, explain the boy's behavior. So it's certainly compatible with it. My worry with the behavioral rules account is empirically, at least in the, I've only done these two experiments, but at least in the infant literature now, there are now more and more experiments in lots of different situations. And it doesn't seem likely anymore that just one behavioral rule will do, or two, or three. You can kind of feel the slippery slope of it, right? That at some point, when do we say, okay, they're using this many behavioral rules and it's no longer plausible? It's not obvious to me where we draw that line, but at least based on the development data, I'm starting to get worried that the behavioral rules account isn't able to support the huge variety of conditions that we're starting to see kids, they seem to be able to explain behavior. And I mean, I guess you could always say, to me, it doesn't sound crazy to say that maybe kids have 200 behavioral rules, maybe they've got 2,000 or 2 million. None of that actually sounds crazy to me at all. What worries me is that when it slips to, when it starts to approach infinity, then we run into problems, right? But so I don't know, it's a really tricky thing to address. When do you say behavioral rules is no longer a plausible explanation?
I think we need to compare it against what it amounts to say that a 9-month-old infant has beliefs, has the ability to attribute beliefs to someone else. And does that mean that they have the concept of belief? And what's all involved in understanding the concept of belief? Do they have to know that belief is opaque? Do they have to, all of these other things, correctness conditions for belief, truth and falsity? Does that all come online at 9 months? Because then you're looking, that ability is looking even more kind of crazily robust than having an approaching infinite number of behavioral rules.
Yeah,
I mean it's a trade-off. That's all I mean.
Yeah, and well, there's also the issue of a lot of those additional aspects of our concept of belief. They may not all come online, or they may not all be developed in the 9-month-old. Some of those things might be sort of things that emerge later on. I wouldn't even rule out that they're in place early. I'm willing to accept the crazy hypothesis, but that's why I'm also willing to accept that maybe there are 2 million behavioral rules. I don't think any of those things are any more likely than the other, because part of the problem is that we don't have any sort of theory that makes strong predictions about what should be in the kid's head. It's just, we just have sort of these more vague sort of ideas that, okay, well, maybe we should have a rich interpretation, or maybe we shouldn't, but we're light on the details, so. I'm willing to entertain the crazy possibility that, it's really rich conceptually, or they've got 2 million behavioral rules. It seems all plausible to me.
More work. Right?
Yeah.
Good, thanks. There's one more question.
I want to ask about cognitive penetrability again. You said your work was ongoing, so I didn't say much about it. The experiments, that is. But you can think of cognitive penetrability in 2 ways that it can be penetrable. In one way, it becomes automatic after a while. It's penetrable for a while, and then it becomes automatic, like learning to play the piano. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, you listen to instructions. Afterwards, you no longer listen to instructions, and then it becomes impenetrable. Mm-hmm. Or it becomes apparently impenetrable. If you look back at your remarks about automaticity, cue-driven actions. You said that it's not always possible to say that it's cue-driven because sometimes there are threshold effects which might confuse you. You might think it's a cognitive thing when it's in fact just a matter of threshold.
Mm-hmm.
But are there threshold effects also with respect to the other, namely cognitive penetrability?
Yeah.
Because if there are conditions under which it's cognitively penetrable, then you can take a highly learned, a very complex learned action, which is which looks automatic, looks cognitively impenetrable. But if somebody who is a therapist knows how to bring the right issues to mind, then they can change it. Which is really the skill of the therapist. I think that is the point that you were making earlier.
Yeah. That's a great suggestion. I mean, it seems to me that that sort of threshold argument applies equally well to the cognitive penetrability side of the system. And if you don't meet whatever it is, whatever those criteria are for being able to chip away or influence the internal processing, you're going to miss it. I do wonder in our experiment what kind of information that you could possibly give that would be more relevant to the task, because we try to, we tell them, that essentially the boy's search is random, everything that precedes it is irrelevant, it's completely independent. And then after the task, we even test them to make sure that they've understood that all the information that comes before that final screen is useless. And they understand that. And so I do wonder what we could have provided, if we did miss that threshold, I do wonder what we could have provided them with that could have bumped them up.
Just to follow up, what about saying something like, this is not a person?
Like this is just a robot that's sort of got the human.
It has no mind, it has no intention.
Yeah.
It doesn't know how to say those things, and now all of a sudden the verbal instructions will make a difference.
Yeah, that actually makes a nice prediction, because on the cue-driven account, you should think that they're still getting all the social cues like they were before, but now they're being told this thing isn't an agent. And yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Okay, so I was really interested in the second half, any of the eye tracker studies where it's not anything that involved just looking at no instructions, because of course you can do that with apes, and I study apes, so that's what I was interested in. But what's interesting is I immediately thought of the study you talked about, where the children were predicting or saying which candy bar the boy liked, and because they've done that with macaques. I don't know if you've seen that data.
I haven't.
Yeah, so they've done it with macaques, but the problem is you can't differentiate look versus want.
Yeah.
And so that data, my question is, is that data, what does that data tell you? Is that just cueing looking? So the macaques will look where the photo of the macaques' googly eyes are looking. So they have googly eyes either looking one direction or the other, and the macaques will look at that, and then they'll look at that food, and they can kind of manipulate that behavior. But how can you tease apart that meaning anything more than something very simple in cueing?
So I mean, the way that I thought the data was interpreted, at least in the human case, right, is that it is something like a gaze cueing thing when you ask the look question, and both the healthy and the atypically developing kids can do it. But when you ask about want, right, I mean, that doesn't seem like cueing alone could be sufficient, right? You have to sort of make that extra inference. I mean, the fact that the kids with autism are pretty much at chance, that seems to me to suggest that if it was just gaze cueing, they should be able to knock it out, right? Because they can do it when it's just looking. But it's something about, the system just doesn't compute the want part, and it doesn't make that small little inference to figure out, well, looking, therefore wanting. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah, it's just too bad you can't do it in some way that doesn't take away instruction. Because it's a look and want, or, anyways.
Maybe I think I'm missing the, how do you mean by taking away?
Well, because I want to basically do the same experiment, but showing something.
Oh, I see, right. So you can do it in non-human primates. Yeah, I wonder how it's a tough one.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, maybe we'll solve this problem over drinks. Can you please join me in thanking Adam very much for this very interesting talk?